Did history truly begin where we were taught to look? Or perhaps is the celebrated dawn of civilization merely the midpoint of a story far older and infinitely more complex than we dare to admit? We often anchor the trajectory of human history to the Fertile Crescent, to Sumer. And when we speak of Sumer, the gravitational pull always leads us back to the Anunnaki, those figures who descended from the heavens, established the first cities, and allegedly engineered humanity itself. This narrative, powerful and deeply entrenched in the clay tablets we laboriously decipher, forms the bedrock of modern alternative archaeology. Yet if we approach these ancient records not as closed statements, but as fragments of an ongoing cosmic logbook, an unnerving question begins to surface from the deepest recesses of the cuneiform script. What precisely existed before their arrival? The common historical account begins with the establishment of kingship after the Great Flood, defining a clear demarcation point, a year zero. But the texts themselves refuse to be so conveniently organized. They contain shadows, echoes, and long lists of beings and structures that preceded the moment the Anunnaki stepped onto the muddy plains of Mesopotamia. These are not merely mythical flourishes or poetic attempts to describe chaos. They are meticulously recorded histories, often given disproportionate space and terrifying longevity, suggesting a fully operational, if conceptually alien, order that was fundamentally disrupted. We must look past the familiar figures of Enlil and Enki for a moment, and instead focus on the sheer weight of what the Sumerians themselves recorded about the era that came before them. It is in this examination of the whisper of the forgotten timeline that the foundation of our entire investigation rests. The unease begins when we recognize that the Sumerian king list, perhaps the most critical document for tracking early civilization, allocates reigns of unimaginable duration, tens of thousands of years, to rulers who governed in cities that existed before the deluge. These individuals were described not as gods in the sense of the later pantheon, nor as mortal men, but as figures of immense temporal scale, bridging the gap between creation and recorded history. This astronomical span is the first crack in the official narrative, forcing us to confront a time when the very laws of biological and historical decay seemed suspended or perhaps simply operated under a different set of universal parameters. This brings us to the cracks in the official narrative. Why document a history that stretches back so impossibly far, if only to dismiss it as non-human or mythological? The Sumerians were meticulous record keepers. Their entire society was built on detailed accounting. They documented cattle, trade, and star charts with precision. If the pre-Diluvian kings were merely myths, they would have been recorded as such, relegated to the domain of poetry. Instead, they were listed sequentially, city by city, with the solemn declaration that kingship, the very structure of ordered governance, had first descended from heaven prior to the events that ushered in the recognizable era of the Anunnaki. This suggests that the arrival of the Anunnaki was not the inauguration of order, but perhaps a re-establishment of order, following a catastrophic breakdown of a preceding, immense, but ultimately forgotten structure. If these ancient whispers stir something within you, if you feel the weight of this forgotten timeline pressing against the edges of modern understanding, take a moment, pause. Allow the gravity of this discovery to settle. This is not casual history. This is uncovering the roots of existence. We invite you to join this collective reflection. If you recognize this profound significance, let us know in the comments below, simply by stating, "Deep time," and ensure you are prepared for the journey ahead by acknowledging this effort and subscribing, securing your place as one of the few who dare to truly look back. Let us now move closer to the 0 point of history. For the Sumerians, the ultimate reset button was the flood, yet the texts dedicate significant effort to outlining the lives and reigns before that cataclysm. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak. These cities existed in the pre-flood world, and their names carry a weight that transcends mere geography. They were the centers of the original kingship. The beings who ruled them were the true predecessors. They were the ones managing the mechanisms of the planet when the Anunnaki were, perhaps, still distant observers, or perhaps not yet necessary governors. This leads directly into echoes from the age of kingship before the flood. What kind of governance did these beings exert? If their reigns spanned millennia, they were operating on cycles incomprehensible to human lifespan. Were they regulating planetary energies, maintaining the infrastructure of a world built not for speed and change, but for stability and eternity? The pre-Anunnaki existence, as hinted at in the earliest lists, was characterized by longevity and deep, slow-moving purpose. It suggests a time when the cosmic blueprints were rigidly enforced, a time defined by a primordial, almost geological, patience. It was an era that required minimal intervention, operating perhaps under the direct influence of the oldest celestial forces, those that the later active operational gods, the Anunnaki, would eventually challenge or replace. We begin to sense the signatures of the architects. If the Anunnaki were the engineers of our civilization, who engineered theirs? The existence before was not simply a vacuum, it was a functioning system, and that system left signatures. These are not always explicit tablets detailing creation myths. Sometimes they are coded into the astronomical observations, the precise alignment of the structures, and the very words the Sumerians used for order and law. The term me, pronounced me, often translated as divine decree or universal law, is key. The me were the essential attributes of civilized life, handed down to maintain the structure. But where did the me originate? Were they proprietary to the Anunnaki, or were they inherited artifacts salvaged from the preceding, vaster and quieter existence? The evidence points towards inheritance, suggesting the Anunnaki found a pre-existing instruction set and decided how best to utilize it, adapt it, or hide its true source. As we delve deeper, the narrative progression leads us to the Watchers of the Deep Time. The cycles inherent in Sumerian thought, the predictable return of celestial bodies, the cyclical nature of time itself, suggest a profound understanding that nothing truly vanishes. It merely retreats. The forces and entities that structured the pre-Anunnaki world, whatever they were, are not erased from the cosmos. They are simply waiting beyond the current observational threshold. The texts hint at great cosmic cycles where governance shifts, where one group of gods steps back as another takes the reins, often after a period of immense global crisis, like the flood. The purpose of meticulously recording the pre-flood era, therefore, was not merely history. It was a map, a warning, a recognition that the foundational rules established in the deep time still hold sway, and the observers, from that epoch, are still watching the current experiment unfold. This deep time structure is encapsulated in the missing tablet, a glimpse into primordial order. We do not have a single unified account detailing the political and social hierarchy of the pre-Anunnaki era, but we have fragments, linguistic, architectural and philosophical, that suggest an order so stable, so fundamentally rooted in cosmic law, that it barely needed active management. Imagine a mechanism so finely tuned that its components last for geological epochs. The Anunnaki arrival conversely brought speed, conflict, intense labor and human creation, a history of volatile intervention. The existence before was quiet, long and impersonal. It was the primordial operating system upon which the human application was forcibly installed. The missing tablet, metaphorically speaking, is the user manual for that original operating system, detailing its profound indifference to the affairs of the smaller, shorter-lived species that succeeded it. And this has direct consequences for us, forming the inheritance of clay and starlight. If the structure of the world was established by one group of architects and then inhabited and modified by a second, the Anunnaki, humanity is the product of a composite creation. We were allegedly made from clay, but what was the starlight component? What inherited resonance do we carry from the vast, slow-moving world that preceded our creators? The lingering presence of this pre-Anunnaki existence might explain the deep-seated human obsession with cycles, destiny, and the sense that we are participating in a drama far larger than the scope of recorded history. Our very existence might be a testament to the durability of the initial cosmic blueprint. As we move closer to the specific moment of transition, a sense of the shadow of the imminent return begins to loom large. The Sumerian obsession with astronomical precision was not just academic, it was existential. They understood that the current cycle, presided over by the Anunnaki lineage, was temporary. Just as the preceding order collapsed, so too must this one. The true revelation hidden within the early texts is the knowledge that the forces that existed before the Anunnaki, the ones who set the deepest foundation, are likely the same forces that will reclaim the stage when the current epoch concludes. The history of the world is less about who arrived and more about who waits. The current turbulence in our world, the fracturing of established orders, might simply be the earliest signs that the long, slow, geological clock of the universe is counting down to a fundamental realignment, a return to the parameters established during the deep time. This brings us to the ultimate question that will propel us into the next phase of this investigation, the critical moment of change. The texts are vague about the specific trigger for the flood and the subsequent assumption of global authority by the Anunnaki. Was it a natural disaster they survived, or was it a necessary cataclysm they engineered to wipe the slate clean and install their own governance? Regardless, the shift required a signal. It required the recognition that the ancient, quiet, pre-Anunnaki rule had failed or reached its allocated end. We are standing on the threshold, facing the monumental task of understanding, crossing the threshold, the arrival signal. To understand what existed before the Anunnaki, we must understand the moment their arrival transitioned from potential observation to active intervention. What external or internal sign, be it celestial, geological, or technological, told them that the ancient order was broken and the time for their own grand experiment had finally come? That signal, hidden within the earliest surviving fragments of cuneiform, is the key to unlocking not just the past, but the recurring patterns that dictate the future of our world. If you have navigated this initial deep dive into the shadows of history, if you feel that insistent pull toward the knowledge that lies outside the accepted timeline, then you are ready for the next phase of this serious investigation. This requires dedication and focus. So, if you are truly committed to tracing this lineage back to its 0 point, ensure you are subscribed to the channel now and press the like button to signal your readiness to engage with the complete 9-part series. Your participation in this discovery is crucial. We ask you to comment below with the exact phrase, the 0 point, a quiet acknowledgement of the true beginning. Only by understanding the structure that preceded the Anunnaki can we truly grasp the motives and the eventual fate of the world they created. Now let us prepare to dive even deeper into the specific identities and mandates of those original architects in Part 2. Does the foundation of our civilization rest on a story that starts abruptly, or merely on a record that was interrupted? We have spent countless hours gazing into the cuneiform tablets, examining the narratives of the Anunnaki arriving, establishing Eridu, and imparting the May, the divine decrees or civilizing gifts, to humanity. Yet if we pull back, allowing our eyes to defocus just slightly from the compelling drama of their arrival, we begin to perceive the unsettling silence that precedes it. This silence is not merely a lack of documentation, it is an active historical vacuum, a gap in the timeline so profound that it suggests deliberate exclusion rather than simple oversight. The Sumerian king lists themselves, those chronicles of astonishingly long reigns that stretch back into the antediluvian era, suddenly hit a wall. When the texts speak of the flood, they speak of a reboot, a radical severance from what came before. But what if the severing was not absolute? What if the deluge merely submerged a physical reality, leaving behind metaphysical and intellectual traces that the succeeding powers either overlooked or, more critically, appropriated? We are searching for the echo of a forgotten civilization, a presence whose name was expunged not entirely by the chaos of nature, but by the necessity of a new political and theological order. If the Anunnaki were to be established as the sole source of wisdom, as the architects of this new world, then the memory of any sophisticated structure that existed prior had to be systematically dimmed. Consider the immense spans of time delineated in those oldest records. When we speak of pre-diluvian reigns lasting tens of thousands of years, we are not necessarily discussing literal human lifespan. We are grappling with a concept of time that is cyclical, cosmic, and almost incomprehensible to modern linear thought. These periods suggest systems operating on scales far beyond the needs of fledgling humanity. They hint at a governance, perhaps a different kind of guardianship, active during those vast cycles before the Anunnaki established their local hegemony. If a watch had been set for 90,000 years, the departure of one shift of observers does not mean the entire system was abandoned. It implies a changing of the guard, or perhaps an invasion of the established territory. This is where the texts start to feel uncanny. The speed with which Sumerian civilization sprang forth immediately following the Great Flood is miraculous, almost impossible. There is no slow crawl from cave dwelling to complex city-states. Instead, we see sophisticated administration, advanced agricultural planning, legal structures, and most tellingly, complex cosmological knowledge, all seemingly handed over intact. If the Anunnaki truly arrived to a blank slate, the teaching period should have been protracted, marked by trial and error, but the record suggests an inheritance, not a creation from scratch. It suggests that they arrived, found a foundation already laid, and simply adjusted the keystones to fit their own architectural design. The profound recognition dawning upon us is this: the Anunnaki arrived not to an empty planet, nor to savages, but to a functional, occupied stage. Who were the original tenants? What was the nature of their order, and why did the incoming powers fail to mention them, except in the most fleeting and often antagonistic terms? If the weight of this cosmic memory resonates with you, if you feel this journey into the deep past is vital to understanding our present, take a moment. A simple gesture, a like, a subscription, is not just support for the channel, it's a commitment to this shared intellectual quest. Let us know in the comments if you too have sensed that the story we were told is incomplete. Your participation is an essential part of decoding these subtle omissions in the historical narrative. The search for the before must move beyond the literal translations of the arrival stories and into the linguistics of the deep past. There are certain terms, archaic roots embedded deep within the Sumerian language, the world's first written language, that appear to be loanwords from a source older than Sumer itself. These are not words for simple objects, but concepts, certain numbers, specific celestial notations, and perhaps most intriguingly, words related to the movement of water and the calibration of time. These are the linguistic shadows of the forgotten. If the Anunnaki gave us language, why does that language already contain residual concepts that predate their specific instruction set? This suggests that the people they encountered were not illiterate, but rather speakers of a predecessor language, one that was partially preserved and integrated into the new lexicon imposed by the incoming celestial beings. This recognition generates a powerful sense of intellectual disquiet. We are dealing with an act of historical revisionism on a cosmic scale. The incoming gods, the Anunnaki, needed to legitimize their claim to Earth and to humanity. To do so, they had to effectively erase the memory of the previous epoch, the previous overseers. We find traces of these previous overseers not in the main narratives, but in the marginalia of later mythologies, in the shadowy figures sometimes referred to as the primeval watchers in texts that are slightly peripheral to the mainstream Mesopotamian canon. While later Hebraic traditions would heavily modify the concept of the watchers, the original root, traceable back through Akkadian and possibly Sumerian references, points to beings who were present, observing, and perhaps even governing Earth long before the arrival of the specific pantheon centered around Enlil and Enki. These were beings of immense power, often associated with geometric knowledge and astronomical precision, whose tenure ended abruptly or disastrously. It is here we encounter the deep connection between the textual anomalies and the architectural anomalies of the ancient world. If the earliest Sumerian cities were built using knowledge imparted solely by the Anunnaki, why do we find evidence of megalithic precision, often associated with astronomical alignments, that seems to require a level of engineering sophistication that the Anunnaki themselves, in their subsequent earthly activities, rarely replicated or taught to humans immediately? We are forced to consider the possibility that the foundations, the deep, inaccessible underpinnings of places like Eridu and Ur were not laid by the newcomers, but were simply inherited ruins, repurposed by the arriving celestial forces. The structure was already there, waiting. The true implication of this pre-existence is that the entire framework of our mythological cycles is fundamentally misread. We tend to view the arrival of the Anunnaki as the definitive start of the current cycle of civilization. However, if they were merely successors, inheritors of a terrestrial stewardship, then the entire story of humanity is one of serial governance. This realization reframes the concept of return. When the Sumerian texts speak obliquely of the return of the gods, we are typically taught this refers to the Anunnaki. But if the Anunnaki were themselves temporary stewards who displaced an earlier, more esoteric order, then the possibility arises that the cosmic clock is counting down not to the reappearance of the familiar, but to the reassertion of the forgotten. The unease deepens when we contemplate the possibility of active historical erasure. What was so critical about the pre-Anunnaki presence that its memory had to be not just neglected, but actively suppressed through the careful curation of the historical records available to the earliest human scribes? It suggests a rivalry, perhaps a conflict, that the succeeding powers wish desperately for us to forget. The very act of forgetting becomes, in this context, the strongest piece of evidence we possess. It is the stain of deliberate omission upon the otherwise meticulous record. Our investigative journey must therefore follow this trail of deliberate forgetfulness. We must look for the linguistic slips, the architectural anomalies beneath the foundations, and the mythological fragments preserved only in the most obscure texts, texts which may have escaped the editing processes of the conquering powers. We are seeking a signal buried deep beneath the noise of our own history, a beacon left by the true original observers of this planetary experiment. This signal whispers not of a beginning, but of a continuation. This sustained inquiry, this willingness to challenge the foundational narrative of our own species, requires immense focus and patience. It demands that we treat every ancient word not as a statement of fact, but as a coded message designed to survive immense historical pressure. The next stage of our investigation takes us directly into those peripheral records, the texts that survived despite their dissonance with the official narrative. If you have stayed with us through this dense tapestry of temporal uncertainty and mythological complexity, it is because you recognize the gravity of what is at stake. The knowledge of the before is the key to understanding the full cycle, the full pattern of our existence. If you believe this work is crucial, if you are committed to discovering the truth of our ancient inheritance, now is the time to commit to this channel. Please ensure you are subscribed and tap the notification bell so you do not miss the next critical piece of this ongoing investigation. Give this video a like to help others find this hidden history. And finally, if this part 2 has solidified your suspicion that something major was omitted from our past, leave a comment below with this specific phrase: "The Watchers were here first." Join us in part 3 as we turn our attention to the specific cuneiform fragments that detail the immediate transition of power, revealing the subtle clues left behind by the vanquished or forgotten civilization that truly existed before the Anunnaki arrived. Was there ever a moment, a sliver of time, when the grand narrative we inherited from the clay tablets felt too convenient, too perfectly packaged? We have scrutinized the details of the Anunnaki arrival, their organization of the first cities, the lineage of kingship descending from the heavens, and the intricate, often violent establishment of order on earth. But history, particularly a history as ancient and profound as the Sumerian record, is rarely a flawless mosaic. More often, it is a palimpsest, a parchment where an earlier, nearly forgotten text lies, ghosted beneath the dominant inscription. It is in the silence, in the textual gaps, and in the strange ambiguities surrounding the most fundamental cosmological descriptions that we begin to perceive the whispers of what existed before. The Sumerian king list, often cited as a foundational historical document, speaks of kings ruling for impossibly long periods before the Great Flood, a time so remote it slips into mythic prehistory. Yet, even within the king list, the focus immediately shifts to the establishment of the Anunnaki infrastructure: Eridu, Badtibira, Larak, Sipar, and Shurupak. This narrative efficiency, this sudden transition from vague antiquity to precise political structure, should cause us to pause. It suggests not a natural progression of memory, but perhaps a conscious or subconscious textual boundary. The history that matters, the history that defines human civilization according to the tablets, begins with them. Everything preceding it is relegated to a nebulous, unquantifiable before. Why is this primordial era, a time of vast, almost unimaginable duration according to their own metrics, treated with such linguistic sparsity? The texts themselves offer cryptic clues that resist being shoehorned into the standard Anunnaki creation myth. Consider the references to the Abzu, the deep, dark, watery abyss, often associated with Enki, Ea. While Abzu eventually becomes a domain managed by the arriving deities, its initial description is one of raw, untamed potential. It is the primordial repository, existing outside the organized hierarchy established by the second generation of cosmic beings. If the Anunnaki arrived to set up a new operational base, then the Abzu might represent the enduring architecture of what they were inheriting, a system they had to either subdue, integrate, or perhaps simply reactivate. This is the intellectual precipice we stand upon, recognizing that the Anunnaki might not have been the pioneers of this sector, but rather the successors or caretakers appointed to a long vacant domain. This sense of inherited responsibility generates an inescapable feeling of strangeness when reading these ancient accounts. It implies a grander foundational reality that predates even the celestial wars and the organization of Nibiru itself. The structure of forgetfulness appears deliberate, woven into the very fabric of how Sumerian knowledge was transmitted. It is the kind of selective memory that arises when a previous regime's profound yet inconvenient achievements must be minimized to legitimize the current power structure. We are not just looking for older gods, we are looking for the mechanism of historical erasure, the point in the cosmological timeline where the slate was wiped clean, or at least strategically smudged. If this idea resonates with the deeper current of intellectual curiosity you carry, if you feel that faint vibration suggesting that the accepted timeline is incomplete, then I invite you to participate in this exploration. To understand this colossal mystery, we must approach the texts not as sacred doctrine, but as engineering manuals left behind by successive crews. Take a moment now to ground your thoughts in this investigation. If you find value in the persistent pursuit of these veiled truths, ensure you have liked this video and are subscribed to the channel, allowing us to continue this meticulous reconstruction of history's forgotten layers together. Tell us in the comments if you sense that the Sumerian texts are more about re-engineering than original creation. Your engagement acts as a crucial anchor point in this dense, unfolding narrative. Ndini, we continue our descent into the pre-Anunnaki strata by examining the very notion of cosmic cycles embedded in Sumerian thought. They were profoundly focused on periodicity, on the return of celestial bodies and the repetition of events, not random chaos, but regulated if lengthy patterns of recurrence. This cyclical worldview, deeply ingrained in astrology and governance, suggests a history that doesn't move in a straight line, but in vast, looping orbits. The arrival of the Anunnaki, detailed so extensively in the cuneiform tablets, may therefore represent not a beginning, but merely the most recent, pivotal return within an established cosmic rhythm. What if the before was not empty, but simply a phase of cosmic withdrawal? The precursors, the first movers, may have left earthly affairs dormant, perhaps due to catastrophic celestial events or the completion of a grand project. Their departure would have left behind not a void, but massive latent infrastructure, the raw materials, the genetic blueprints, and perhaps even the very vibrational frequency of the planet, all imprinted with the pattern of the original occupants. The Anunnaki, upon their arrival, would then have been confronted not with a blank canvas, but with the haunting shadow of a preceding intelligence, requiring recognition and strategic appropriation. This leads us directly to the inherent disturbance in the lineage of the gods themselves. We observe a clear dichotomy between the archaic deities, often embodiments of primal natural forces like Tiamat, saltwater chaos, and Apsu, sweet water order, and the highly structured anthropomorphic pantheon of the Anunnaki, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, etc. While the texts explain this transition through warfare, the Enuma Elish, that narrative of conflict might be a sanitized mythical overlay designed to explain a far deeper discontinuity. The conflict may have been less about physical dominance and more about ideological or functional replacement. They had to justify why the ancient, immense forces were suddenly subordinate to the newcomers who specialized in governance, mining, and genetic manipulation. The recognition of this preceding stratum elevates the very function of Eridu, the first city listed as established after the descent of kingship. Eridu is universally tied to Enki, Ea, the god of water and wisdom, and the one most associated with the Abzu. But if Eridu was the first beachhead, why was it built upon a foundation deeply connected to the pre-existing watery domain? It is possible that Eridu was not merely a convenient starting point, but a strategic interface, a city constructed precisely where the residual energies or infrastructure of the before were most concentrated. It served as a massive operational nexus designed to tap into and control the inherited systems left by the precursors. The foundational technology of Eridu may have been a relic, meticulously studied and subsequently repurposed by Enki's specialized crew. As we look deeper into the meaning of the mythos, the fundamental laws or divine decrees that govern civilized life and technology, we find further complexity. These me were often said to be stolen, or at least transferred under duress, usually involving Enki and Inanna. But where did the me originate? Were they invented by the Anunnaki, or were they fundamental operational codes discovered and codified by the first beings who mastered this planetary sector? The transfer of the me might symbolize the crucial moment when the Anunnaki successfully downloaded and took ownership of the foundational programming of this world, a programming that existed irrespective of their arrival. This understanding shifts the focus of the Sumerian texts from a history of divine creation to an account of sophisticated terrestrial re-engineering. The Anunnaki were masterful engineers, but the scale and speed of their civilization building imply that they were operating with pre-existing blueprints. They recognized the inherent signal of the world they found. They understood the cosmic coordinates and the optimal timing for their appearance, because the planet itself carried the imprint, the signature of the previous occupants, a signal that perhaps only those who understood the deep cycles could detect. We must consider the possibility that the knowledge recorded in Sumer, the advanced astronomical understanding, the mathematical systems, the sophisticated metallurgy, was not entirely a product of Anunnaki tutelage to humanity, but rather a direct inheritance. Perhaps these systems were merely the stripped-down, manageable portions of a vastly more complex operating system left behind by the precursors. These ancient observers, those beings who watched the passing of the great year and prepared for the next shift, may have simply preserved what they could, knowing that the memory of the ultimate origin would fade, replaced by the necessity of the immediate operational history dictated by the arriving Anunnaki. If we accept this, then the lingering question becomes, what were the precursors doing? If they established this immense foundational system, what was their ultimate purpose before their abrupt withdrawal? The lack of detailed information about their activities is the most profound revelation. It confirms their absolute otherness, a level of existence so removed from the Anunnaki's anthropocentric concerns, gold, governance, lineage, that their operations simply did not translate into the language or concerns of the subsequent regime. Their work was too vast, too cosmic, perhaps too abstract to be recorded in the earthly concerns of brick-making and canal digging. This realization breeds a profound sense of intellectual unease. If the Anunnaki were merely the custodians of an inherited legacy, then the true, absolute beginning of Earth's history remains concealed, waiting beneath the layers of their operational reports. We are left looking at the meticulously documented structures of Sumer, the ziggurats, the libraries, the complex social codes, and wondering if they are not monuments to the Anunnaki themselves, but sophisticated markers left by the precursors, activated only when the cycle dictated the return of the next managing intelligence. The texts, therefore, are not simply telling us about the Anunnaki. They are acting as a subtle, layered warning system, alerting future generations, us, that what we perceive as the root of civilization is merely the middle chapter of a much longer, more terrifyingly vast history. The before is not just a historical period. It is a potential future, the phase where the current management might withdraw, leaving behind their own legacy for the next intelligence to decode. The deep cycles continue to turn, and the evidence of the precursor's existence is not static. It is waiting for the precise moment of cosmic alignment to reveal itself again. If you have stayed with us through this dense investigation, recognizing that the very foundation of history might be a carefully constructed deception of memory, then you belong here. You are one of the observers tracking these enormous, silent movements beneath the surface of the established narrative. To ensure you do not miss the next phase of this critical reconstruction, where we delve specifically into the remaining potent traces of the precursor's legacy, Please take a moment now to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your like on this video helps us continue the extensive research required to uncover these truths. And finally, let your position be known. Comment below with the phrase, "The architecture of forgetfulness." That phrase anchors our shared understanding that the Sumerian texts reveal less about creation and more about the management of a profound, inherited mystery. Join us in the next part, as the focus shifts entirely from the managers to the original master plan and the clues left behind for us to finally decode. We must ask ourselves what kind of silence awaited the Anunnaki upon their arrival, assuming the Sumerian accounts hold even a fraction of the structural truth they claim. It is not the silence of true cosmic nothingness, the vast and cold vacuum before matter coalesced, but a particular, almost oppressive quietude, the silence of something that has been emphatically, deliberately forgotten. The texts hint at a landscape that was physically present, a primordial earth ready for cultivation, yet intellectually empty of recognized sentience, at least in the manner that the newcomers defined it. But if the Anunnaki were inheritors, not original architects of the terrestrial potential, what were they inheriting? This is the fundamental question that deepens the chasm between mythology and history. The strangeness we encounter when reading these oldest fragments is not simply the existence of pre-flood epochs or giant beings. It is the uncomfortable observation that the Sumerian scribes, meticulous record keepers of every grain measure and celestial observation, dedicated space to documenting the absence of their current gods. They catalogued what came before, not with triumphant fanfare of the Anunnaki taking control, but with a somber recognition of an almost palpable void. This estrangement forces us to confront the possibility that the first actions of the Anunnaki were not purely creation, but perhaps a kind of profound archaeological cleanup operation, clearing the conceptual debris left by a predecessor civilization that failed to sustain itself or, more disturbingly, chose to leave. We begin to recognize the faint, unsettling echo of this precursor when we delve into the nature of the me, those divine decrees, the fundamental operating principles of the universe and civilization, which were apparently guarded, stolen, or perhaps simply recovered by the Anunnaki deity Inanna. If the me were the essential blueprints for civilization, moral codes, arts and technology, why were they not inherent to the Anunnaki themselves? Why did they need to be acquired, implying an original source predating their reign? The implication is one of intellectual salvage. The Anunnaki found the discarded instruction manual for existing on Earth, a manual written in a language of cyclical time and complex knowledge, that they then adapted and claimed as their own genesis. This recognition suggests a far more complex historical layer than simple divine visitation. It paints the Anunnaki not as originators, but as astute beneficiaries of a sophisticated infrastructure that vanished. This brings a deep sense of disquiet. If a civilization, or a collection of entities, so advanced that their conceptual legacy formed the very foundation of the subsequent Anunnaki rule, could utterly vanish from the face of the earth and the records of the stars, what are the implications for our current state? The texts suggest that time operates not as a linear arrow, but as a vast wheel of forgotten cycles, where complex systems rise, achieve equilibrium, and then, for reasons perhaps linked to inherent terrestrial entropy or cosmic timing, simply disappear. The silence the Anunnaki found was not emptiness, but the sound of the gravitational pull of a past that had completely collapsed. This narrative of cyclic destruction and forced forgetting is often woven into the earliest Sumerian warnings, serving as a subtle mandate to the reader: understand the debt to the past, or be swept away by the next cycle of erasure. If this deep dive into the underlying architecture of the texts resonates with your own intuition about the fragility of history, then you are participating in this intellectual excavation alongside us. This journey requires patience and a willingness to question the accepted timeline. If you feel compelled by the sheer weight of what might be hidden in plain sight, take a moment now to acknowledge that journey. Hit the like button to show that you value this careful reconstruction. And if you haven't already, subscribe to ensure you don't miss the subsequent critical parts of this unfolding revelation. Your engagement helps us bring these obscure histories to light, affirming the importance of this sustained, deep exploration. The gradual revelation continues when we look past the grand narratives of Anu and Enlil and focus instead on the more ambiguous figures often grouped under the name of Watchers, or the vague references to the Igigi being before they were tasked with their later rebellious roles. These were the ones who left signs, not monuments. They left geometric signatures in the environment, not necessarily giant stone cities, but rather abstract patterns of energy or knowledge imprinted onto the very fabric of the landscape. The Anunnaki arrival might have been catalyzed by the detection of this lingering energy, a highly specific, powerful signal that suggested intelligent life had once mastered this planetary sphere. They didn't find ruins. They found an open circuit, a complex running program without a visible operator. This heightens the intellectual disquiet. What strange technology or knowledge did the Anunnaki find that did not originate with them? The texts hint at tools and processes related to deep earth manipulation, the creation of synthetic life, a process distinct from standard procreation, and instantaneous transport, capacities that seem to exceed the needs and even the descriptions of the Anunnaki civilization itself, at least initially. These might be the ultimate relics of the precursors, technologies so powerful they were less understood and more repurposed, like finding a functional fusion reactor and using it merely to boil water. The Anunnaki's great technological leap, which seemingly occurred overnight according to the records, might not have been a leap at all, but rather the activation of residual systems left behind. The precursor civilization, in this light, was perhaps not destroyed by an external force, but vanished due to internal complexity, leaving behind a functioning, if dormant, technological matrix. This tension brings us to the conceptual void. We are constantly seeking to define the Anunnaki as creators because that is the cultural language we inherited. But the deeper we read, the more they seem like recreators or administrators. If the fundamental principles of order, me, were recovered and the functional technology was repurposed, where does the original act of creation reside? This challenges the very notion of supreme power. The Anunnaki may have been powerful, but the Sumerian insistence on documenting what came before suggests an acknowledgement of a power that was more fundamental, a source of wisdom that transcended even the celestial power structure of the newcomers. This void is where the true mystery lies, the profound difference between being the first to arrive and merely being the first to claim ownership of the keys left under the cosmic doormat. Why did the Sumerians feel the need to record this before? This is perhaps the most human aspect of the entire narrative. They seemed burdened by a sense of history they could not fully grasp. The tablets detailing the periods before the flood, before the kingship descended from heaven, are filled with a strange mixture of awe and psychological compulsion. It wasn't just historical accounting, it was a form of debt payment, an ethical necessity to acknowledge the vast preceding intelligence. The Sumerians acted as the unintentional guardians of the memory of a civilization that the Anunnaki themselves may have preferred to see erased. They preserved the ghost in the machine, ensuring that the lingering presence, the shadow of the precursors, remained part of the human psychological landscape, a constant reminder that our current iteration is merely one step in an infinitely long line of planetary inhabitants. This ancient acknowledgement of the lost age finds an uncomfortable parallel in our modern scientific inquiry into the cosmos, the persistent search for the great filter. If advanced life is common, where is everybody? The Sumerian texts offer a chilling answer. They are not extinct in the traditional sense. They simply transitioned, or perhaps failed to perpetuate their material presence, leaving behind only the subtle imprints of their mastery. Their departure was so clean, so absolute, that only the most dedicated textual deconstruction can reveal the subtle shifts in language that betray their existence. This parallel suggests that the lessons of the Sumerian precursors are not just historical artifacts, but universal warnings about the transient nature of material civilization. We are now approaching the critical point of observation. The deeper we dig into the layers of the cuneiform, the clearer the question becomes. Where did the precursors leave their ultimate signature, the final signal they intended to transcend the Anunnaki era? If their legacy was primarily conceptual and technological, their physical presence must be encoded somewhere that the Anunnaki either couldn't or wouldn't destroy. This leads us away from the familiar temples and towards the geospatial arrangements and the deep seismic knowledge subtly hinted at in the descriptions of the earliest cities, especially those like Uruk, established under seemingly impossible conditions. If you have stayed with this complex and winding narrative, if you have felt the weight of these centuries-long secrets resting upon the delicate clay tablets, then you are precisely the viewer for whom this investigation is intended. This is not casual viewing, this is deep historical immersion. To continue this journey with us and to prove the worth of this exhaustive effort, ensure you are subscribed to the channel. Please take a second now, hit the like button and leave a comment below with the specific phrase, "The Echo of Uruk." This phrase is your confirmation that you recognize the critical importance of what preceded the known gods. In our next segment, Part 5, we will analyze the precise textual references detailing the geographical anomalies and the critical signal that the precursors left behind, pushing us closer to understanding not just who they were, but what their message was for us, their eventual successors. Don't go anywhere. The path to the original source is only just beginning to clear. Was the arrival of the Anunnaki, chronicled in such meticulous detail across thousands of recovered clay tablets, truly a beginning or merely an interruption? When they descended upon this plane, were they greeted by the primal silence of absolute creation, or by the subtle, resonant echo of a civilization that had already perfected the art of departure? This question, the weight of pre-existing architecture and the lingering residue of advanced knowledge, is the invisible current that runs beneath the surface of the entire Sumerian narrative. We have long focused on what the Anunnaki built, but perhaps the most revealing truth lies in what they found already standing. Structures massive and confounding enough to defy their immediate understanding. Monuments that spoke of engineering principles alien even to their own advanced capabilities. Imagine the first teams arriving, not to an empty landscape ready for colonization, but to a vast, silent ruin, a skeletal framework of geometry and purpose that predated their star charts. The unsettling realization must have dawned upon them quickly. They were inheritors, not originators. They were explorers entering an abandoned museum whose exhibits still retained a faint electrical charge. The texts suggest this initial strangeness through descriptions of sites being repurposed or activated, rather than being built from the ground up. Take Eridu, often cited as the first city, the landing place. Why does the description of its foundation feel so much like the reactivation of an older node? It is as if they found a gigantic, complex motherboard, slightly scorched and powered down, and their primary task was to plug in the correct sequencing code to bring its core functions back online. This unfamiliar blueprint, scattered across the Earth, must have introduced immediate cognitive dissonance. The Anunnaki possessed the technology for mining, genetics, and interplanetary travel, yet the massive foundational stones found in the Near East display weathering patterns and construction techniques that seem to laugh at the capabilities of 450,000 years ago, or even 4,500 years ago. These stones, described in certain apocryphal commentaries as the bones of the deep earth, stand as silent witnesses to cycles of time far grander than the brief epochs we currently assign to recorded history. The Anunnaki, being sophisticated observers of celestial mechanics, would have immediately recognized the signs, the evidence of a catastrophic shift, a great sleep that had enveloped the previous inhabitants, forcing them to abandon their complex infrastructure. This recognition would have transitioned quickly into a profound sense of uneasiness. It is one thing to conquer a virgin world. It is another to occupy a graveyard where the prior inhabitants simply chose to leave, leaving behind advanced instruments designed perhaps to warn future generations, including the Anunnaki themselves, about the inherent instability of this specific terrestrial environment. It is here that we begin to understand the Anunnaki's supposed divinity not as inherent power, but as a mantle of inherited stewardship. They did not create the primary tools of creation. They simply learned how to wield them. They inherited the ultimate burden. The technology left behind was not benign. It was immense, powerful, and likely designed to stabilize a failing planetary system. To use it required decoding the ancient warning signals embedded in the very structure of the environment. If you find yourself pondering the sheer arrogance required to declare oneself a god in a landscape littered with the superior ruins of a previous power, then you are beginning to grasp the true psychological weight carried by the newly arrived Anunnaki. If this perspective, that the power dynamics established on Earth were merely the repair crew dealing with the tools of the forgotten engineers, resonates with you, pause for a moment to consider sharing your thoughts on this idea in the comments below. Do you believe the Anunnaki were true creators or superior maintenance technicians? Such collective reflection deepens our understanding and helps the broader community continue this essential investigation. If you find this journey into the lost history compelling, an expression of support through a like or subscription ensures we can dedicate the time and resources to unveil the remaining fragments of this colossal narrative. The uneasiness only intensified with the realization of the observers. The Sumerian texts, particularly those dealing with the earliest establishment of the me, the divine decrees or technological rules, hint at a subtle, pervasive monitoring system left behind by the predecessors. The arrival of the Anunnaki was not unwitnessed. They came to a world where the infrastructure was dead, but the surveillance system was merely dormant. This suggests that the predecessors, those who existed before the Anunnaki, did not merely disappear. They transcended, perhaps ascending to a vibrational plane or dimension, leaving behind certain entities or automatons whose function was to ensure the integrity of the inherited systems. These ancient guardians, the silent watchers referenced elliptically in later Babylonian mythos, were likely the true source of the Anunnaki's initial constraints. Why would a supremely powerful race submit to a complex, restrictive set of rules, the aforementioned me? Because those rules were the operating manual for the inherited technology, and the maintenance crew dare not deviate from the engineer's instructions, lest they trigger a catastrophic system reboot. This brings us to the timing of the Anunnaki's return, a concept suggesting they had been here before, or perhaps that their cyclical function necessitated a specific arrival window. This wasn't random interstellar travel, it was calculated. They waited for the great alignment, the cosmic synchronization of forces that allowed the inherited architecture to be safely powered up again. The cycles of destruction are intimately linked to celestial mechanics, a cosmic clock that dictates the rise and fall of civilizations on this planet. The previous civilization fell not by conquest, but by adherence to this inescapable rhythm, a rhythm that the Anunnaki, for all their power, were powerless to stop, only to mitigate temporarily. We must scrutinize the Sumerian records for what is absent, for the calculated omissions that define the narrative presented to humanity. The texts we possess are the edited version, the official history released by the ruling power. Where are the tablets detailing the exact nature of the predecessors' governance? Why is the description of the period immediately prior to the Anunnaki so vague, often shrouded in metaphors of watery chaos or primitive ignorance? This is the core of the gradual revelation. The Anunnaki systematically redacted the true extent of the previous mastery to solidify their own position of divine inheritance. They needed to appear as the originators of order, the bringers of light, rather than the custodians who simply flipped the generator switch based on instructions left taped to the control panel. Their claim to divinity, therefore, rests precariously on a foundation of omission. They are not gods in the sense of primary creators, but rather high-level administrators who inherited the keys to a vast, complex, and partially ruined estate. The question then becomes, did the Anunnaki truly understand the technology they were employing, or were they merely following procedures they were instructed to maintain? The frequent internecine conflicts detailed in the tablets, the struggles between Enlil and Enki, the rivalries over access to the me, suggest a profound struggle for control over systems whose full operational parameters remained mysterious, echoing the classic uncertainty of a secondary user attempting to master the work of a genius programmer. This pervasive sense of repetition, the realization that everything they were doing was merely a variation on a theme played out countless times before, casts a long shadow over the entire Sumerian epoch. If the predecessors transcended the cycle, why did the Anunnaki insist on replicating it, albeit with advanced technological intervention? Perhaps their mandate was simply to maintain the framework, to keep the lights on until the next scheduled cyclical event. This makes our current civilization not the pinnacle of Anunnaki guidance, but merely the lingering result of their attempts to stabilize a fundamentally unstable inherited system. We are living within the parameters of a failure state they tried, and perhaps ultimately failed, to fix. The key to unlocking the true identity of those who existed before lies in locating the complete, unedited instruction manual, the texts that detail the true technological relationship between the Anunnaki and their silent predecessors. We must turn our gaze now to the specific documents, those fragments that survived intentional erasure, which describe not the grand deeds of the newcomers, but the silent, meticulous processes of decipherment and reconstruction they were forced to undertake. These fragments reveal the protocols the Anunnaki had to adhere to, rules that demonstrate they were operating within a boundary established long before their ships ever darkened the Mesopotamian sky. If you have stayed with us through this deep dive, you have demonstrated a commitment to understanding the hidden layers of history that few are willing to peel back. You recognize that the greatest truths often lie in the inconvenient gaps of the historical record. To continue this investigation and ensure you do not miss the crucial upcoming segments, including the analysis of those forgotten protocols, please subscribe to the channel now. If this examination of inherited power and cyclical history resonated with you, show your support by hitting the like button. And to mark your presence in this discovery, please leave a comment using the exact phrase, "the burden of the inheritance." Join us next time as we delve into the protocols and the forgotten science that truly governed the Earth before and during the Anunnaki's tenure. A segment you won't want to miss appearing right here on your screen now. Can we truly quantify the silence that preceded history, or is the perceived void merely the result of a deliberate epical erasure? We have navigated the difficult terrain of the Sumerian tablets, examining the fragmented glimpses of entities and systems that governed existence before the arrival of those we name the Anunnaki. But to truly grasp the weight of their arrival, we must confront the nature of the vacuum they filled. A vacuum that suggests not annihilation, but a strategic retreat, or, perhaps more disturbingly, a failure of duty. It is in the obscure stanzas of texts that whisper of the Abzu being managed by primordial beings, long before Enki was assigned his domain, that the strangeness begins to settle deeply into the historical foundation. These pre-Anunnaki entities, often referenced only through their functions, as early keepers, as those who measured the flow of the primal waters, existed within a framework of cosmic obligation. Their presence was dictated by a geometry of duty, a structure rooted not in personal ambition, but in the maintenance of universal order. The Sumerians had a concept central to their theology and cosmology, known as the Mi'i. These were not merely laws. They were the essential divine decrees, the binding forces that defined the functions of civilization, governance, technology, and art. If the Anunnaki were the administrators who later implemented and enforced the Me on Earth, then what, or who, established the Me for the primordial beings themselves? This question forces us to look beyond Earth, beyond Nibiru, into a system of cosmic hierarchy so vast that the Anunnaki presence here might only be a middle management tier in a structure stretching back into impossible deep time. The gradual revelation here is that the entities who preceded the Anunnaki were not defeated in a conventional war, nor did they simply vanish. Their disappearance, as inferred from the cuneiform record, feels more like a systemic shutdown, a function that reached the end of its intended operational cycle, or perhaps a willful abdication of an intolerable burden. The tablets are strangely discreet about the transition, skipping rapidly from the era of pure, almost theoretical creation to the arrival of the Igigi and the eventual establishment of Eridu. This historical lacuna, this sudden shift in management, is the most profound clue we possess. It signals a great forgetting, whether induced by galactic catastrophe or by the purposeful efforts of the incoming administration to secure their own narrative, burying the evidence of their predecessors' systemic flaws. If we recognize that the entire framework of documented human history, from the moment of writing onward, is largely shaped by the perspective of the Anunnaki and their legacy, then the subtle references to the before take on immense significance. They are the archaeological whispers from beneath the foundational layer of myth. The silence is not empty, it is saturated with the weight of the previous epoch, a cycle completed, a duty left unfulfilled. To truly understand the motivation behind the Anunnaki's massive, resource-intensive operation on Earth, we must stop seeing them merely as gold miners or colonizers and start viewing them as inheritors of a project that was already ancient, already possibly failing, and bound by cosmic obligation to continue. If this idea resonates with your own reflections on deep history and the hidden dimensions of ancient texts, pause for a moment. Consider commenting the phrase, "the burden of the previous cycle," below. Your participation in deciphering these ancient signals helps illuminate the darkest corners of the archaeological record, allowing this shared investigation to deepen and endure. The silent signal of return, therefore, was not the launching of a single mission from a distant world, but the culmination of cosmic timekeeping. The Sumerian accounts, permeated as they are with astronomical precision and the observation of great celestial cycles, strongly suggest that events on Earth, the rise and fall of management, the establishment of civilizations, were synchronized with vast, predictable orbital mechanics. The Anunnaki arrived when they did because the signal indicated the precise window for intervention. This cyclical recurrence implies that the failure of the pre-Anunnaki entities was inherent to the long-term programming of that cycle itself. Perhaps they were merely temporary placeholders, designed to maintain stability until the next major orbital conjunction triggered a necessary, perhaps violent, shift in stewardship. What exactly did the Anunnaki inherit when they took charge? It was more than just the planet's raw materials. They inherited the infrastructure, the basic template for life, the biological experiments already underway, and critically, the lingering problems associated with the previous era's mismanagement or exhaustion. We are weighing the inheritance, recognizing that the Anunnaki's subsequent efforts, the gene manipulation, the demanding labor, the intense regulation, were potentially desperate measures applied to a situation that was already spiraling. A fix-it job inherited from beings whose names were deliberately allowed to slip into the collective amnesia of the cosmos. There is a period suggested in the deeper layers of the myths, a time of observational stasis. This was the moment before the full descent, when the Anunnaki, perhaps the Igigi stationed in high orbits, watched and waited. They were the observers, studying the inevitable decline of the existing order. The texts, particularly those dealing with the earliest forms of worship and the establishment of temples, describe a world ready for governance, not one needing initial creation. This observational stasis implies a surgical precision in the timing of their intervention, a moment calculated to maximize efficiency and minimize conflict with whatever remnants of the previous order might have survived. It suggests a patient, strategic intelligence far removed from the emotional squabbles later attributed to them. The difficulty we face lies in the deep time paradox. The fact that our linear human perception struggles to grasp the sheer antiquity and repetitive nature of cosmic events. When the cuneiform tablets speak of a time when destiny was not yet determined, they are speaking in terms of cosmological timescales that dwarf our recorded history. The Anunnaki era, spanning thousands of years, is itself a mere footnote in the potential history of Earth, which may have hosted multiple intelligent stewardship projects, each lasting eons before collapsing into dust and silence. Our obsession with the Anunnaki period risks blinding us to the true scale of the drama that played out before the first mining operation even began. We must turn back to the shadows in the text, those frustratingly ambiguous phrases that defy simple translation. Sumerian cuneiform, with its multiple layers of meaning and shifting phonetics, often conceals as much as it reveals. When a text refers to the foundations or the original structure, is it speaking of a geological layer or the administrative system established by the preceding entities? When the name of an early god is listed, only to be replaced rapidly by an Anunnaki counterpart, we recognize the clear evidence of a narrative overlay, a rebranding designed to obscure the historical transfer of power. We are constantly searching for the faint, residual signature of the forgotten architects beneath the loud, clear signature of the new management. The necessity of the Anunnaki's arrival, therefore, must be seen as a function of a shift in cosmic tides. The energy signatures, the orbital alignment, the status of the failing project on Earth, all aligned perfectly. This was not chance. It was the mechanism of the universe demanding accountability and intervention. This moment, the transition from the silent era of the first Watchers to the tumultuous vocal era of the Anunnaki, represents the true fulcrum of human history. The legacy we inherited is not just the genetic manipulation performed by Enki and Enlil. It is the fundamental instability and cyclical nature of governance that has plagued every epoch since. We stand now at the threshold of disclosure, poised at the moment of transition. We have moved past simply asking if something existed before the Anunnaki and are now confronting the challenging truth of what its failure meant for the incoming administrators. The narratives confirm that the slate was not clean, the Anunnaki did not start from zero. They arrived with a mandate, an urgent mission to stabilize a long-term failure inherited from entities that remain largely obscured by the mists of deep time. The next steps in our investigation must focus on the immediate consequences of this inheritance, and how the Anunnaki struggled to contain the forces, both physical and spiritual, that the previous cycle had unleashed. If you have navigated this labyrinth of ancient knowledge, pushing past the comforting narrative to confront the unsettling truths hidden within the Sumerian tablets, your commitment to uncovering this reality is invaluable. We are building a deeper understanding of the cosmic blueprint, piece by piece. If this journey into the profound silence of the before resonates with you, I invite you to join our growing community of observers and researchers. Take a moment to ensure you are subscribed to the channel and give this video a like so that this essential investigation can reach others who question the accepted history. To seal this chapter of our collective journey, comment the word Heransa. In our next part, we will analyze the first physical evidence left by the pre-Anunnaki entities and what the new administrators did to contain it. The transition was brutal and the cost was immeasurable. Click the video on your screen now to continue this essential investigation into what the Sumerian texts truly reveal. What if the most profound realization regarding the Sumerian texts is not what they explicitly describe, but the cavernous silence that surrounds their descriptions? We have been meticulously examining the arrival of the Anunnaki, the construction of the early cities, and the sudden blossoming of civilization itself, yet the shadow of the preceding era, the world that existed before their vessels touched down, lingers like a residual vibration in the very clay of the tablets. We must consider the immense psychological barrier faced by the early scribes. They were recording a history that was handed to them as doctrine, built atop the ruins of a reality they were perhaps forbidden or intellectually incapable of fully grasping. The official narrative, the one that establishes the Anunnaki as the sole progenitors of organized society, serves not merely as a historical record but as a deliberate screen, masking a deep-time civilization whose complexity challenges the very concept of historical linear progression. The vestiges of this forgotten time are not found in obvious drawings of advanced machines, but in the pervasive sense of temporal dissonance that permeates the oldest myths. Why did the Sumerians possess astronomical calculations so precise they necessitate observational periods far exceeding their established timeline? Why are their foundational concepts of governance, architecture, and even hydraulic engineering presented not as ingenious inventions, but as inherited blueprints, ready-made gifts from the sky beings? This suggests the Anunnaki were not merely imparting knowledge, but resurrecting operational frameworks recovered from the wreckage of the previous, submerged culture. This recognition is profoundly unsettling. It implies the history we are taught to read is merely the second or third chapter of a much longer, brutal narrative, one characterized by cyclical collapse and selective restoration. Consider the notion of the Abzu, the primordial deep, often mythologized as the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, the domain of Enki. While interpreted geographically, could the Abzu also function as a sophisticated metaphor for the profound, overwhelming depths of forgotten memory? The place where the memory of the previous world was deliberately submerged, left to drift in the subconscious collective, until it resurfaced only as chaotic myth and monstrous imagery, suitable for religious control, but unfit for historical scrutiny. The beings that existed before the Anunnaki, the ones who established the foundational knowledge, must have possessed a grasp of universal mechanics that transcended the limited, resource extraction-focused perspective of their successors. We find clues in the fragmented descriptions of the tools used during the pre-diluvial age, tools described not in terms of metal, but in terms of resonance, light, and harmonic frequency. These subtle indicators hint at a technology based on a different understanding of physics, one perhaps entirely overlooked by the Anunnaki, or one they intentionally chose to suppress and replace with more readily exploitable terrestrial methods. The true moment of intellectual friction occurs when we pause and ask why. The Sumerian tradition felt compelled to include stories of creation and conflict that clearly predate the Anunnaki arrival, stories that speak of primordial battles between forces that seem almost purely conceptual or elemental. This is the ingrained human instinct fighting against the imposed narrative, a recognition that complex systems do not arise from nothing, and that the sophistication of early Sumer must have had a lineage stretching back through millennia, swallowed by catastrophe. If we are to truly understand the scale of the pre-Anunnaki presence, we must look beyond the clay tablets and into the very landscape of the ancient Near East, examining the geological anomalies and structures that defy conventional dating. The foundations laid down by a civilization that understood global catastrophe not as an unforeseen event, but as a predictable component of a greater cosmic clock. The Anunnaki arrival, then, was not a pioneering mission, but a sophisticated reclamation. If you are finding yourself lost in the echoes of this deep past, wrestling with the implications of historical cycles rather than linear timelines, you are not alone. This journey requires not just academic scrutiny, but an opening of the mind to possibilities that fundamentally restructure our understanding of our origins. We are attempting to read the ghost script written between the lines of the official Sumerian narrative, a task that demands persistence and shared reflection. If this pursuit of the hidden history resonates with you, I urge you to participate in this discovery. Take a moment to acknowledge the effort required to excavate these profound truths from the dust of ages by liking this analysis, and subscribe so that we can continue to explore these astonishing connections together. Your sustained interest fuels this deep investigation into what existed before the slate was wiped clean. The most disturbing evidence of this earlier, erased civilization lies in the concept of inherited amnesia. The Anunnaki certainly recorded the arrival, but they established their rule over a population that carried a genetic memory of prior knowledge, a knowledge that manifested as unease and a sense that something monumental had been lost. Think of how quickly the initial Anunnaki purpose, resource extraction, was mythologized into divine creation. This swift transformation from practical engineers and overlords to mythical gods suggests an active, enforced historical obfuscation. The previous civilization, the inhabitants of the pre-diluvial earth, were either utterly destroyed or their remnants were subsumed and mentally re-engineered. The Sumerian tablets, while revealing, might also be our earliest example of state-sponsored historical revisionism, where the truth is tailored to justify the current power structure. We must scrutinize the very structure of the Sumerian king lists, those astonishing documents that detail reigns stretching back for tens of thousands of years before the Great Flood. Modern academia dismisses these reigns as hyperbole, symbolic rather than literal. But what if they represent the actual timeline of the civilization that existed before the Anunnaki took control? A timeline the Anunnaki preserved only partially, perhaps as a record of the cosmic cycle they were observing. The staggering lengths of these early reigns might reflect epochs, not human lifetimes, documenting the rise and eventual catastrophic failure of the civilization that prepared the world the Anunnaki inherited. This earlier group possessed the wisdom to track these vast cycles, the knowledge of the mechanisms of cosmic renewal and destruction. They left a warning, a sign that the Anunnaki discovered and perhaps misinterpreted or deliberately twisted to serve their own short-term agenda. The evidence points increasingly to the fact that the Anunnaki were not colonists in an empty world, but squatters in a sophisticated ruin. They utilized existing infrastructure, geographical nodes, energetic ley lines, and perhaps even pre-established atmospheric conditioning systems, which allowed them to rapidly establish centers of power like Eridu and Nippur. The difficulty lies in separating the Anunnaki's pragmatic modifications from the original profound designs of the pre-ones. The Sumerians themselves felt the weight of this temporal layering. The deepest spiritual fear was not the wrath of the gods, but the return to chaos, the overwhelming forces of the Tiamat, the embodiment of the saltwater deep. This fear, consistently expressed, is the emotional echo of the civilization that drowned, the ultimate memory of a world erased by water and geological violence. If the preceding civilization perished because they failed to heed their own warnings about the cosmic cycles, what did they try to communicate to the future? Perhaps they encoded their ultimate failure not in grand monuments, which are easily destroyed, but in language itself, embedding subtle anomalies and philosophical truths within the very structure of Sumerian thought that would survive any physical collapse. This subtle coding is what we, thousands of years later, are just beginning to perceive, the sign of a civilization attempting to whisper across the gulf of deep time. It is a whisper that tells us our history is not unique, and that the patterns of development, collapse, and re-emergence are built into the fabric of this reality. The lingering question, the one that prevents any conclusion and drives the continuity of this investigation, is this: if the Anunnaki were merely the inheritors of a catastrophic cycle, observers who capitalized on a collapse that eradicated their predecessors, then what happens when our current civilization, built precariously upon the fractured foundations of all that came before, reaches the terminal point of this shared, recurring cosmic pattern? If you have journeyed with us this far, acknowledging the profound and often uncomfortable truths embedded within the oldest clay tablets, you understand the gravity of this exploration. You are part of a crucial collective seeking to understand the true nature of history's cyclical flow. To ensure this deep analysis continues and reaches those who are also asking these critical questions, please lend your support. Subscribe to the channel immediately, hit the like button, and to mark your commitment to unraveling this hidden past, leave a comment right now using the phrase, "The Abzu still whispers." Only by working together can we confront the astonishing reality of what existed before the Anunnaki arrived and prepare for what might come next. Our investigation is far from over, and the final stages of the Sumerian revelation await in the next part of this series. Do not miss it. The implications for our own time are becoming terrifyingly clear. Is it possible that the deepest silence in the historical record is not merely an absence of data, but a profound, engineered quietude? We have journeyed through the cuneiform shadows, recognizing the Anunnaki narrative as an established, albeit disruptive, middle chapter. But the lingering question, the one that presses the heaviest on the mind, is why the transition from the ones before to the arrival of the Anunnaki is treated with such startling brevity in the very texts that otherwise catalogue every detail of lineage and decree. It suggests a deliberate truncation, a surgical excision performed on the collective memory of the first human civilizations, or perhaps a willful neglect of what was deemed irrelevant or, far more chillingly, dangerous to remember. The earliest Sumerian accounts, those which survived the great floods and the collapse of empires, speak often of origins, of the first water, the first land, the first king. Yet when they touch upon the precursors, those mysterious entities or energies that laid the groundwork for the eventual structure of earthly life, the language shifts. It becomes metaphorical, abstract, almost fearful. It is as if the scribes, bound by the sacred duty of transcription, were recording not knowledge, but a void where knowledge should have been, a vast, negative space outlined by fear. The Anunnaki arrived to an operational infrastructure, cities, or at least proto-cities in need of management, resource extraction routes already established, perhaps even a basic working populace ready for labor. They did not appear onto a barren, untamed world, but into a system waiting to be appropriated. This recognition, the recognition that the arrival was an inheritance rather than a creation, throws the entire established chronological paradigm into temporal dissonance. We must ask, who built the stage before the primary actors stepped onto it, and why did the primary actors insist that the stage had always been their design alone? This great forgetting, this pervasive cultural amnesia regarding the true dawn of consciousness might be the most crucial clue hidden within the Sumerian tablets. It points not to a simple historical oversight, but to an ancient decree that mandated the erasure of a memory too potent, too destabilizing for the emerging world order. When we contemplate the sheer antiquity required for the development of the high-level genetic and planetary engineering suggested by the pre-Anunnaki fragments, the shaping of the orbit, the placement of the elemental balance, we are faced with a civilization that operated on cosmic scales. Such a force would make the Anunnaki, with their focus on gold and earthly labor, seem like mere custodians, provincial landlords managing a deeply complex, already mechanized estate. Understanding this required perspective shift is essential, a commitment to seeking truth beyond the comfort of the established narrative. If you find yourself wrestling with these deep historical paradoxes, feeling the intellectual tension between what we are told and what the silent stones suggest, then you are ready for the next level of this inquiry. To ensure you don't miss the upcoming revelations, the final pieces of this exhaustive study, I urge you now to gently engage with the mechanism that supports this research. Confirm your subscription to the channel and leave a subtle acknowledgement in the comments. A simple residue, perhaps, to show your dedication to peering into these deeper shadows. The exploration of these cylinders of perpetual return, embedded in the texts, reveals a fascinating truth about the nature of time itself as viewed by the ancients. Unlike our modern linear progression, a straight arrow perpetually moving forward, the pre-Anunnaki texts often alluded to vast spiraling cycles, eras that completed, collapsed, and restarted, not merely geological ages, but consciousness cycles. The Anunnaki arrival, therefore, may not have been a unique moment of initiation, but rather the execution of a scheduled maintenance protocol at the end of a previous catastrophic cycle. They were potentially the inheritors of the knowledge of how to reset the clock, how to guide the burgeoning life forms back onto a functional trajectory, but they were not the designers of the clock itself. This interpretation transforms their status from celestial gods to high-level managers of a cosmic blueprint they themselves did not originate, bringing a profound sense of unease. We begin to sense the presence of the unseen architect, an entity or collective signature so pervasive yet so subtle that its influence is only evident in the foundational mathematical and astronomical precision of the Sumerian structures. If the Anunnaki built temples, who set the parameters for the stars they used for alignment? If they taught agriculture, who genetically prepared the soil and the seed stock over millennia? This architect operates outside the dramatic narratives of war and succession that define the Anunnaki. Its signature is found in the elegant silence of the numbers, the constants of the universe, as understood by the most ancient astrologers. We are looking for the echoes of a power that saw the Anunnaki themselves as mere temporary custodians, perhaps even as necessary tools for the continuation of the grand experiment. This brings us to the whispered warning, the inherent danger the ancients recognized in recovering the true history. If humanity were to fully comprehend the scale of the civilization that existed before the Anunnaki, and the scale of the destruction or abandonment that led to its end, It would fundamentally destabilize the current structure of reality, which is built on the myth of our own uniqueness and the immediate divinity of our earliest instructors. The knowledge that we are living within a controlled recovery zone, a rehabilitation period, overseen by figures who are themselves subordinate to an earlier, greater mystery, is a truth too vast for conventional society to bear. The Sumerian priests, guardians of these dangerous fragments, may have understood that certain truths must remain buried, not to protect the gods, but to protect the fragile human psyche from the vertigo of true cosmic scale. What remains evident, however, is the weight of inheritance. The Anunnaki clearly utilized and repurposed the remnants of the previous age. The descriptions of their initial dwelling places, the Edin or Abzu, do not suggest entirely new constructions, but highly sophisticated refurbishments. The technology they wielded, the ability to rapidly alter geological features, manipulate gravity, and accelerate evolutionary processes, carries the distinct flavor of appropriated knowledge, not self-developed science. Think of a child inheriting an impossibly advanced computer system. They learn to operate the software and even program new functions, but they did not design the chipset. The texts reveal inadvertently that the Anunnaki possessed the keys to the kingdom, but not the foundational blueprints, constantly requiring reliance on ancient, cryptic formulas. We must now search for the zero-point calendar, that elusive moment that precedes even the established pre-Diluvian king lists. The king lists begin with the concept of kingship descending from heaven, a defined moment of Anunnaki installation. But what preceded the descent? Scattered references in lesser-known commentaries suggest a time measurement based not on orbital cycles of Nibiru, but on cosmic constants, on the slow pulsing of distant stars recognized only by the prior civilization. This calendrical system speaks of timescales so immense that the 432,000 years of the official king list becomes a mere blink in the overarching chronology. To recover the zero point is to acknowledge that the history we accept is merely the most recent user manual, not the history of the machine itself. And then there are the whispers of the observatory of the silent gods. We are not speaking of ziggurats, which are relatively recent, but of far older megalithic complexes hinted at in the descriptions of Eridu's earliest foundations, that were utilized purely for astronomical observation, disconnected from terrestrial concerns. These were places built to watch the heavens for a specific sign, a signal of return or perhaps a warning of the next cyclical catastrophe. These structures, predating the Anunnaki's operational tendency, were not built to honor the visitors, but perhaps to monitor the movements of the ones before, suggesting that the precursors were not merely extinct, but distant, still observing their creation from outside the solar frame. This continuous discovery leads inevitably to the seed of doubt, the gnawing realization that our current reality, our civilization, our scientific understanding might be nothing more than a highly advanced maintenance phase. If the precursors existed at a level of technology that allowed them to shape planetary physics and engineer consciousness on a grand scale, then everything we see, the rise and fall of empires, the evolution of species, could be perceived as controlled variables within a cosmic laboratory designed to test resilience or repair damage. The Sumerian texts, when stripped of the later theological overlay, become technical documents describing a carefully managed system, prompting the terrifying question, is history truly unfolding, or is it merely being replayed? The implications of this structural reality are enormous, demanding we consider the context of the Anunnaki themselves. Were they truly independent rulers or highly specialized agents, perhaps even drones or biological automatons, tasked with specific regulatory duties? Their intense focus on resource extraction, gold, and reproductive control, human labor, suggests a highly functional utilitarian mission, devoid of the deep philosophical complexity one might expect from the originators of existence. They were the management team that arrived after the collapse, using the inherited tools to stabilize the failing system. As we prepare to turn the final corner in this investigation, moving from recognition to confrontation, we are faced with the ultimate question of the Sumerian archives. What message did the predecessors leave for us, knowing that their work would eventually be overshadowed by the arrival of these powerful yet finite beings? The next stage requires an absolute focus, a willingness to step into the philosophical void that the texts both outline and conceal. If you have stayed with this relentless scrutiny, navigating the complexities and embracing the sheer scale of the history we are uncovering, then you are truly dedicated to unraveling the deepest mysteries of human existence. This journey into the pre-Anunnaki era is reaching its climax, and your commitment is the engine driving this research forward. Do not let this exploration fade into the background. Ensure you are subscribed to the channel now, if you haven't already, and hit the like button to signal that this profound level of inquiry deserves to continue. To mark your presence at this crucial juncture, please comment the specific phrase, "The cycle continues." Only those who recognize the gravity of the ancient patterns understand the true scope of this revelation. The final, dense chapter awaits, directing us toward the ultimate identity of those who preceded the Anunnaki. Click on the video now appearing on your screen to join us for the decisive conclusion. Where does the line truly blur between history and mythology, and what happens to the narrative when the figures we assign the role of creators arrive only to find a world already aged, already bearing the scars of an era that predates their very memory? This is the silent question that has haunted every step of our journey through the Sumerian tablets, a whisper of recognition rising from the dust of Mesopotamia. We have tracked the linguistic shadows, followed the non-sequiturs in the royal lists, and deciphered the uneasy silence surrounding the dawn of civilization. It is a silence not of absence, but of deliberate omission, as if the official record of the Anunnaki rule begins precisely at the point where a catastrophic discontinuity occurred, sweeping away the traces of what came before. The evidence is never found in bold, unambiguous statements declaring, "Before us existed X." Instead, the truth lies in the strange functional details, the sheer sophistication of engineering that the early Sumerians attributed not to their benevolent instructors, but to a forgotten past, the inexplicable need for the Anunnaki to re-establish order, not merely create it, and the persistent references to the primordial waters and the Abzu, often depicted not as a mythical realm, but as a vast operational structure or reservoir already in place when the newer gods arrived to settle. These textual ghosts suggest that the Anunnaki were not the first architects of this planet, but rather they were the inheritors of an elaborate functioning mechanism, a mechanism that had perhaps failed or stalled just prior to their heralded descent. Imagine arriving at a deserted factory of immense complexity. The power is off, the equipment is monumental, far exceeding your current technology, yet everything bears the patina of abandonment. You don't understand how the machinery works, but you know its function is vital to the local ecosystem. Your task, then, is not invention, but maintenance and adaptation. This is the intellectual space the Sumerian texts force us into when we peel back the layers of divine intervention. The structures described in the initial myths, the great reservoirs, the sophisticated astronomical markers, are not introduced as newly built projects, but as necessary fixtures that simply needed to be managed, repaired, or repurposed. The Anunnaki arrival, then, was less a genesis and more a changing of the guard, marking the transition from a prior, unknown civilization, the echoes of which linger in the very bedrock of the oldest known cities. This recognition generates a profound sense of temporal disorientation. If the Anunnaki, themselves figures of immense antiquity, merely stepped into the shoes of a prior, advanced civilization, what does that say about the true scope of intelligent life on Earth and the cyclical nature of cosmic management? The human mind struggles with the depth of this time scale, yet the tablets subtly urge us to look beyond our narrow window of recorded history. If you are captivated by these unfolding discoveries, by the potential for an entire epoch to be concealed within the mythological veil, and if you feel the urgency of understanding the true lineage of our planet, then this is the moment to fully engage with this investigation. Pause, reflect, and share your most unsettling thought on this revelation in the comments below. Your sustained curiosity fuels this exploration, inviting us all deeper into the concealed truths of the past. Ensure you are subscribed to track the entire scope of this discovery, because the next layers are defined by what was left behind. The inherited void is perhaps the most eloquent testimony. When the Anunnaki established their earthly dominion, they brought with them a sophisticated set of laws, astronomical knowledge, and administrative precision. But what they conspicuously lacked, or perhaps deliberately suppressed, was the complete history of the prior civilization. They were the custodians of the present, but not the chroniclers of the deep past. This is why the Sumerian king lists abruptly transition from the impossibly long reigns of the pre-flood figures, the antediluvian age, to the more human, manageable timelines after the cataclysm. That catastrophic rupture, the Great Flood, serves not merely as a reset button for mankind, but as the final geological marker separating the Anunnaki age from the vanishing era that preceded it. The flood, in this context, was not a random disaster, but a monumental cleansing event that finalized the disappearance of the true, original inhabitants, the keepers of the technology that the Anunnaki found and appropriated. We must confront the idea of the architects of silence. Who were they, and why did they leave? The texts do not offer names, only functions, descriptions of objects, and geographical markers that no longer exist or have been buried under successive layers of myth. They are the unseen supervisors, whose engineering signatures can still be felt in the inexplicable precision of megalithic sites globally, sites far too complex to be necessary for a Bronze Age civilization, yet perfectly aligned to celestial mechanics that predate even the recognized cycles of the Anunnaki's homeworld. The silence is the loudest sound in the archaeological record, a reverberating gap where immense power and knowledge once resided. The signature of the cycle becomes clear. This pattern of arrival, inheritance, utilization, and eventual decay is not unique to Earth. The Sumerian texts, when studied alongside related cosmological myths from other cultures, suggest a universal law of maintenance, that higher civilizations assume control of habitable planets in continuous rotation, taking over the infrastructure of their predecessors when the previous custodians either move on or, more disturbingly, face annihilation. The Anunnaki arrived not to create life from scratch, but to manage and hybridize existing hominids for practical labor, utilizing the existing magnificent planetary machinery of the vanished architects. This uneasy recognition means our current civilization is merely the latest iteration in a cosmic sequence, possibly operating on infrastructure we cannot even perceive. This raises the critical, chilling question: is our own trajectory, our rapid technological ascent, coupled with increasing planetary instability, a signal for the next changing of the guard? The unseen oversight implies that the Anunnaki, for all their power, were themselves observers reporting to a higher authority, perhaps even fleeing a grander cosmic conflict. They descended to Earth with a mission defined by scarcity, the search for gold, and defined by control, the management of the Igigi, and later, humanity. But why here, and why then? The pre-Anunnaki era provides the only plausible answer. Earth was already pre-fitted. It was a functioning, valuable outpost. The oversight was the recognition that the prior tenants had vacated, leaving behind the vital components necessary for the new management structure to succeed. We feel the weight of predecessors not through explicit text, but through the objects of veneration mentioned in the tablets, sacred stones, flying chariots, and weapons of unimaginable power that were always described as being ancient, even by the standards of the gods. These relics were the herança, heritage, physical proof that advanced knowledge did not originate with Enlil or Enki, but was inherited by them. The Anunnaki were merely exploiting the legacy of a greater, lost era. Think of the concept of the me, the divine decrees or powers that govern civilization. These were not manufactured by the Anunnaki, they were collected and distributed, suggesting they were artifacts of a previous operational system. The true power structure was always anchored in the forgotten past. This brings us to the final chronological key, the moment of definitive transition. Analyzing the earliest surviving fragments describing the organization of Earth, specifically the establishment of the 7 major cities before the flood, we find names that do not resonate with the standard Sumerian pantheon. These older primary names, erased quickly after the Great Deluge, point toward different linguistic roots and a different theological framework, a signal of a complete administrative overhaul. The time of Ubar-Tutu and the final pre-flood kings marks the ultimate convergence, the moment when the chaos of the vanishing civilization met the calculated efficiency of the incoming Anunnaki. It was a moment of cataclysmic overlap, a final burst of light before the great esquecimentos, forgetting, settled upon the world, redefining the known timeline. The true scale of time, as revealed by these cumulative fragments, shatters our anthropocentric view. We are discussing cycles that operate not in millennia, but in vast astronomical epochs, periods so long that the arrival of the Anunnaki, 6,000 years ago, is merely a recent footnote in the planetary biography. If we accept the premise that the Sumerian texts are the formalized record of the second major occupation of Earth by off-world intelligences, then the first occupation must stretch back into a time frame that aligns only with geological, not historical records. This forces us to reconsider every assumption about human evolution, suggesting that Homo sapiens may not be the culmination of a single evolutionary line, but the result of repeated, cyclical interventions, each subsequent wave adjusting and manipulating the genetic material left behind by the last. Our investigation culminates in the unsettling prospect of the anticipation of return. If the Anunnaki arrived because the previous custodians left, and if the Anunnaki themselves eventually withdrew or retreated, a pattern suggested by the slow decay of their cults and the eventual rise of purely human empires, then the cycles dictate a pattern of recurrence. The very mechanism that brought the Anunnaki here remains operational. The infrastructure, the signal that governs these cosmic rotations, must still exist. The Sumerian accounts, in their obsessive detailing of celestial events, are perhaps not just historical records, but detailed instructions, a cosmic calendar marking the next transition point. The remnants of the pre-Anunnaki world serve as a chilling warning. When a high civilization vanishes, it leaves behind the void, the infrastructure, and the irresistible invitation for the next inheritors to step into the role of observers and custodians. This brings us to the unwritten postscript. Our journey through these dense, enigmatic tablets has closed the loop, not by providing easy answers, but by expanding the magnitude of the mystery. We now recognize that the foundation of our civilization is built upon ruins far older than the ruins we first excavated. The question is no longer if something existed before the Anunnaki, but what their true connection was to that vanished world, and how much of its residual power they managed to absorb. The ultimate lesson of Sumer is that history is not linear, but concentric, spiraling around a core of deep time and repeated cosmic intervention. The narrative is continuous, the revelation incomplete, and the search must continue beyond the formal confines of this investigation. If you have journeyed through all 9 parts of this exploration, recognizing the profound implications of what existed before the Anunnaki arrived, you understand the magnitude of this concealed history. Your commitment to uncovering these hidden truths is the lifeblood of this investigation. If you have stayed with us until this final decisive moment, please ensure you are subscribed to the channel. Liking this video helps push this crucial evidence further into the light. And to mark your complete absorption of this journey, comment below with the phrase, "The cycle repeats." The clues are hidden in plain sight, waiting for those willing to look past the surface. Do not miss the next step in this profound unveiling. Continue the investigation by clicking on the video now appearing on your screen. The archives of deep time are still waiting to be read.